Oxford's November stones held their secrets in silence. I found Hartwell among his manuscripts, crossword half solved, already dead when they knocked. Some truths arrived too late to heal. Where are you settling in tonight? Perhaps with tea cooling beside you and the evening drawing close around familiar walls. November had folded itself over Oxford like an old manuscript, its pages yellowed with age and dampened by centuries of English weather. In Duke Humphrey's library, the light arrived parsimoniously through diamond panes of glass, casting amber shadows across tables where generations of scholars had wrestled with eternity's questions. The reading room held that particular Oxford silence, not empty, but pregnant with the whispered conversations between the living and the long dead. I had come seeking solitude among the ancient texts, drawn by the peculiar comfort of sitting where medieval scribes had once labored over illuminated manuscripts. The volume before me exhaled that thin, intoxicating breath of old vellum and leather binding, its pages chronicling a monk's meditations on mortality. His Latin was careful and abstemious, keeping his verbs close and his adjectives chastened, as if even ornament might offend death itself. Mors certa, hora incerta, death certain, its hour uncertain, he had written, then crossed out and rewritten with a minute flourish, as though mortality required a signature. The phrase that held my attention was deceptively simple. Iam mortua sunt omnia. All things are already dead. The scribe's marginalia suggested this was not despair, but recognition, a philosophical acceptance that death begins at birth, that we spend our lives in various stages of dying rather than truly living. I found myself wondering whether these words had been penned in youth or age, whether they represented fear conquered or merely acknowledged. Across from me, a student attempted the Times crossword, his pencil hovering like a tuning fork over 7 blank squares. Truth delayed, he muttered, frowning as if the newspaper had personally affronted him. I could have supplied the answer, justice, but meddling in other people's puzzles has always seemed a faintly marital activity, full of good intentions and future resentment. My mobile phone's insistent buzzing shattered this medieval reverie, with the brutal efficiency of modernity intruding upon contemplation. The reading room assistant approached with that particular Oxford politeness that makes apology unnecessary. "Inspector, there is a telephone call for you at the desk." Lewis's voice carried that controlled urgency I'd learned to recognize. Not panic, but the professional tension of a man confronting something that refused comfortable categorization. A body had been discovered at St. Bartholomew's College, he explained with characteristic precision. Professor Adrian Hartwell, a distinguished medievalist whose reputation for scholarly rigor was matched only by his reputation for scholarly reclusiveness. The details emerged with methodical thoroughness. Hartwell had been found dead in his locked study by colleagues who had come knocking for an urgent faculty meeting he himself had convened. They had knocked repeatedly, Lewis said, their concern growing with each unanswered rap on oak. Finally, the master key was summoned, revealing Hartwell slumped over his desk, apparently having died hours before their increasingly frantic appeals. "How did they put it?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Lewis rustled his notes. "The porter told me, and the master repeated it. He was already dead when they knocked." The phrase lodged itself like gristle in my mind. Already dead when they knocked. The fact was mundane. The wording felt ornate, polished on the tongue like something said to be remembered. There was a theatricality to it that pricked at my sense of the absurd. Why that precise formulation? Why not simply "found dead"? The subtle emphasis, the inclusion of the knocking, suggested performance rather than discovery. I closed the manuscript with a librarian's care and a sinner's reluctance. The scribe's marginalia seemed to mock my departure from contemplation toward investigation. His skeletal figures danced their eternal dance, indifferent to whether their audience consisted of 13th-century monks or 20th century detectives. St. Bartholomew's College occupied that particular Oxford geography where centuries fold into themselves like pages in an illuminated manuscript. Tucked discreetly off Holywell Street, it presented itself with the understated confidence of an institution that had survived plague, Reformation, and the more recent plague of academic bureaucracy. Its stones held that particular Oxford patina, not merely aged but seasoned, weathered into wisdom. The walk through Oxford's familiar maze of narrow streets carried me past the Sheldonian's sulking curves and Broad Street's comma-worried sentence structure. The city performs its past like a part learned badly and cherished for that very reason. Each corner held memories of previous cases, previous mysteries that had unfolded in similar settings, where respectability provided a thin veneer over human frailty. Lewis met me at the college's modest entrance, his expression carrying that mixture of professional concern and personal unease that invariably accompanied our more puzzling cases. The porter, a man whose face suggested decades of discreetly managing academic eccentricities, led us through corridors where floorboards creaked with the accumulated weight of scholarly footsteps. Professor Hartwell's study occupied a corner where medieval architecture met Victorian renovation with the awkward compromise typical of Oxford's evolutionary approach to modernization. The room presented itself with the deceptive simplicity of a crossword clue that appears straightforward until one begins searching for the answer. Hartwell slumped forward over his desk, surrounded by the familiar detritus of serious scholarship. Books marked with paper slips, notebooks filled with careful handwriting, scattered papers suggesting work interrupted rather than concluded. Yet something felt deliberately arranged, as if the scene had been composed rather than discovered. The papers lay too neatly for a man who had suffered sudden cardiac distress. His reading glasses, which colleagues insisted he never removed while working, were nowhere visible. Most intriguingly, a Times crossword lay partially completed beside his right hand, with only one clue remaining unsolved. Truth delayed in 7 letters. The same clue that had stymied the student in Duke Humphreys. The coincidence felt less like chance than like fate arranging its own small ironies. As I stood in that silent study, surrounded by the accumulated scholarship of a lifetime devoted to understanding the medieval mind, I found myself thinking again of the manuscript I had abandoned. The scribe's marginalia had suggested that death begins long before the heart stops beating, that we carry our endings within us from the beginning. Perhaps Professor Adrian Hartwell had been dead long before his colleagues came knocking. Perhaps we all are, in ways we cannot yet comprehend. The question, as always, was not whether death had visited St. Bartholomew's College that November morning, but what secrets it had chosen to reveal in its passing. The medieval phrase echoed in my mind as I began the familiar ritual of observation and deduction. Iam mortua sunt omnia. All things are already dead, including, I suspected, the simple explanation that would satisfy everyone except those cursed with the need to understand not just what happened, but why it had been inevitable from the very beginning. The study breathed with that particular rhythm of a mind that had spent decades in conversation with the dead. Books leaned against each other like old friends sharing secrets, their spines bearing the accumulated patina of scholarly devotion. Rain worried at the stone beyond the leaded panes, a soft percussion that settled itself into the pores of the oak. The air was crowded with paper, old glue, the faint phantom of tobacco from some other decade, and beneath it all, another thread of scent I could not yet place. Something clean, but not antiseptic, sweet, but not floral. Hartwell's desk told its own chronology of interrupted thought. Medieval manuscripts lay open at precise angles, weighted down with lead strips that caught the gray November light. A fountain pen rested uncapped beside a half-finished translation, as if arrested by sudden vertigo of mind. The Times crossword occupied the center of this scholarly constellation with an almost accusatory blankness at 17 down, Truth delayed. 7. The same clue that had stymied the student in Duke Humphreys, the same 7 empty squares that seemed to follow me through Oxford like a persistent question seeking its answer. I touched the newsprint and found the paper cold. 6 other clues had been completed in Hartwell's characteristic script, small, careful letters that suggested a mind uncomfortable with wasted space. Only this one remained, as if he had paused to consider whether justice truly was truth delayed, or whether delay itself transformed truth into something else entirely. The pen had been set down with deliberate placement, yet something in the arrangement argued with the posture of sudden death. Dr. Eleanor Vance arrived with the particular breathlessness of someone who has hurried through Oxford's labyrinthine streets while attempting to maintain academic composure. She possessed that quality I'd learned to recognize in former students who had never quite escaped their mentor's gravitational pull. A mixture of intellectual confidence and emotional deference that suggested relationships more complex than their professional designations implied. Her fingers traced the edge of his desk as she spoke, a gesture both protective and proprietary. She had been Hartwell's research assistant for 3 years, though her familiarity with his habits and the unconscious intimacy with which she moved through his study suggested deeper currents beneath that formal title. Professor Hartwell had been agitated recently, she explained, consumed by a discovery in the college archives, something that had disturbed his usual scholarly equilibrium. She had found him one evening standing before the medieval manuscripts with an expression she described as haunted, though she immediately apologized for the dramatic word choice, as if emotional accuracy required constant editorial supervision. "What sort of discovery?" I asked, though her hesitation had already provided half the answer. He had been deliberately vague, she replied, but had made one comment that lingered with uncomfortable persistence. "Some truths are buried so deep they poison the very ground," he had said, then immediately changed the subject with the abrupt efficiency of a man who had revealed more than he intended. The phrase fell through me like a key past a grate, echoing with the weight of prophecy. The scene possessed subtle discordancies that pricked at my sense of the inevitable. Hartwell's papers lay arranged with suspicious neatness for a man who had suffered sudden cardiac distress. The controlled chaos that distinguished genuine scholarship from mere academic posturing had been edited into something more deliberate, more composed. Most significantly, his reading glasses were absent, those essential tools without which, Dr. Vance confirmed, he could not have worked on the close translation that lay unfinished before him. Dr. Sarah Whitmore arrived with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to pronouncing upon mortality with clinical detachment. The college physician possessed that particular Oxford combination of intellectual rigor and social grace, which allows one to discuss death as if it were merely another academic subject requiring careful analysis. Her initial examination suggested death around midnight, though she revised this estimate after considering the room's open window and its effect on body temperature regulation. The window itself presented another small puzzle. November nights in Oxford rarely inspire voluntary ventilation, yet the casement stood open perhaps 6 inches, allowing the damp air to circulate with unwelcome persistence. A curl of curtain had caught in the latch and held there, a pale ribbon marking some disturbance. Dr. Vance mentioned that Hartwell typically kept his studies sealed against the elements, preferring artificial warmth to natural circulation. As Dr. Whitmore continued her examination, that elusive scent grew more pronounced, medicinal yet not quite antiseptic, floral yet not quite natural. It possessed a subtle, almost sweet undertone, something vaguely pharmaceutical that seemed to cling to the air like a phantom whisper of recent presence. The smell suggested someone had passed through carrying traces of hospital corridors or pharmacy shelves, though neither Dr. Vance nor the college physician could account for such a visitor. The medieval manuscripts that had occupied Hartwell's final evening lay open to a treatise on confession and absolution. His translation notes, written in margins with microscopic precision, suggested he had been working on passages dealing with the revelation of buried sins. One phrase had been underlined multiple times: Veritas temporis filia. Truth is the daughter of time. Beside it, in Hartwell's careful script, a question mark followed by the words, or time's victim. The irony of his final crossword clue was not lost on me. 7 letters for truth delayed, the answer hovering just beyond completion. The study's bookcases revealed the accumulated obsessions of a lifetime devoted to understanding how the past refuses to remain buried. Volumes on medieval law stood beside modern works on historical methodology, while a section devoted to Oxford's institutional history suggested interests that extended beyond purely academic concerns into the college's own relationship with uncomfortable truths. Standing among the detritus of serious scholarship, I remained troubled by the scene's subtle wrongness. Death visits scholars as readily as anyone else, and cardiac arrest requires no conspiracy to explain its arrival. Yet something in the arrangement suggested performance rather than discovery, as if the scene had been composed for an audience that would arrive precisely when it did. The phrase Dr. Vance had quoted echoed with uncomfortable resonance. Some truths are buried so deep they poison the very ground. In a room where every book, every paper, every pen had its designated place, the absence of Hartwell's glasses felt like a word deleted from a carefully constructed sentence, noticeable not for what it said, but for the silence it created, in saying nothing at all. The missing spectacles remained the detail that refused comfortable explanation, a small mystery nested within the larger question of whether Professor Adrian Hartwell had truly been dead when his colleagues came knocking, or whether death had arrived with more deliberate timing than natural causes typically provide. The master's lodging breathed with that particular Oxford authority where institutional memory meets personal ambition. Dr. Victoria Ashworth received me in a room that smelled of beeswax and inherited decisions, her study arranged with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous currents of academic politics. Rain worried at the diamond panes while a clock counted out the sort of patience that erodes certainties without appearing to disturb them. She possessed that quality I had encountered in certain Oxford women, an intelligence so thoroughly integrated into her bearing that it required no performance, merely the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being the most perceptive person in any room. Yet something in her manner suggested wariness that extended beyond natural caution, as if our conversation were a chess match where several moves had already been played in silence. Professor Hartwell had indeed requested access to sealed college records, she confirmed, though her phrasing carried the diplomatic neutrality of someone who had rehearsed this revelation. The materials dated from 1974, she explained, documents related to what she termed an academic irregularity that had been resolved internally to protect all parties concerned. The phrase settled between us like a nondescript parcel that might contain explosives or laundry. One could never tell with institutional euphemisms until the unwrapping began. "What precisely lies in those boxes?" I asked, not because I expected candor, but because evasions prove most enlightening when addressed directly. She replied with the careful poverty of diction one acquires from decades of committee work. Examination misconduct involving several promising students and at least one junior faculty member, handled with discretion to prevent damage to careers and the college's reputation. The records had been sealed by agreement, she added, with the understanding that they would remain confidential in perpetuity. "You were here then," I observed, and her eyes narrowed by little more than a breath. "I was a junior fellow," she admitted, and we were all younger and more frightened than we now care to remember. She half smiled and corrected herself. The college was younger and more frightened. In that substitution I heard the soft clink of a key turning in a locked drawer. Hartwell had become insistent about accessing these materials. She continued, more than insistent. He cited statutes, reminded them that history was not a museum, but a courtroom. He had been prepared to discuss 1974, the faculty meeting he had called. She revealed with visible discomfort. The college had agreed to consider his request, though consideration at Oxford often serves as a synonym for burial. Lewis arrived under the cloister with that particular efficiency that marked his most productive investigative periods, his notebook filled with the methodical accumulation of facts that would eventually arrange themselves into patterns of meaning. Hartwell's telephone records revealed 3 significant calls on his final evening, conversations that suggested a man settling accounts before some anticipated reckoning. The first call had gone to Dr. Eleanor Vance at 12 minutes past 7, a brief 6-minute conversation she had described as routine discussion of research matters. The second, more intriguingly, had been placed to a London number belonging to Marcus Finch, an antiquarian bookseller in Bloomsbury, whose shop specialized in medieval manuscripts and historical documents. That conversation had lasted 23 minutes, suggesting business more substantial than casual inquiry. The third call provided the evening's greatest surprise: 47 minutes to Hartwell's brother in Melbourne, remarkable not for its duration but for the fact that the 2 men had not spoken in over 3 years. The timing was precise, 11:11 by the itemized bill, a moment chosen not only for availability but perhaps for the symmetry that appeals to men who believe in signs. What does one say to an estranged brother at such an hour, I wondered? Reconciliation or confession, though which seemed impossible to determine without crossing continents. Henry Blount, the college bursar, possessed that particular collegiate nervousness born of balancing books for men who imagine themselves above arithmetic. His office cramped itself around ledgers that lay open like splayed birds, and he mentioned, with the care of someone advancing across iced pavement, irregularities in recent financial records. Nothing dramatic, he insisted, but discrepancies that required investigation, petty cash withdrawals for conservation supplies that did not align with invoices, consultancy fees described only as external expertise, a reimbursed petrol expense with no journey attached, except a vague notation, London. He kept his forefinger planted upon a column of figures, but looked not at the numbers, but at my face, as if I were the sum that might resolve his calculations. In the ledger's margins I noticed a penciled notation, half erased, Finch, the graphite dull and stubborn. One learns what a man intends to forget by observing how thoroughly he attempts to erase it. The porter provided the evening's most intriguing detail, with the reluctant precision of someone who notices everything but comments on little. Around 2 o'clock that morning, he had observed an unfamiliar car near the Fellows' entrance, a dark saloon that had remained perhaps 20 minutes before departing without explanation. The vehicle had been positioned where it could observe both the main entrance and the side gate that provided after-hours access, its engine running throughout its vigil. "Any registration?" I inquired, though his apologetic shake of the head had already provided the answer. Something with an L, he offered, or possibly a K, and there had been numbers that suggested a pattern without quite achieving one. He had been taking his customary cigarette break, which made his testimony both more reliable and less admissible. The car had departed when he approached to investigate, disappearing into Oxford's labyrinthine streets with the efficiency of someone familiar with the city's geography. I asked to examine his logbook, knowing that even in colleges with modern electronics installed, porters preserve an affection for ink and permanence. The entries for the previous evening were proper and incomplete. Deliveries signed for, keys issued and returned, a doodled maze created against boredom. A page had been torn out sometime during the week, leaving only the chastened impression of letters pressed through from the missing sheet. Tilting the page toward the insufficient light, I could make out fragments that might have read "city cars," though certainty remained as elusive as the vehicle itself. Standing again in that silent study where Hartwell had spent his final hours, I found myself contemplating the architecture of secrets that seemed to surround his death. The sealed records from 1974, the mysterious phone calls, the financial irregularities, the anonymous car, each detail possessed its own significance while refusing to connect into a coherent pattern. Yet something in this constellation suggested that certain truths had grown weary of waiting for their appointed revelation. The crossword clue that had haunted Hartwell's final evening returned to my thoughts. Truth delayed. 7 letters. Still empty. Still waiting. In Oxford, truth often arrived fashionably late, having spent decades circulating through committee meetings and informal conversations before achieving the status of acknowledged fact. The university possessed an almost infinite capacity for transforming scandal into footnote, controversy into historical curiosity. But perhaps some truths carry their own momentum, accumulating weight over decades until they can no longer be contained by institutional discretion. The phrase Dr. Vance had quoted echoed with uncomfortable resonance. Some truths are buried so deep they poison the very ground. In Hartwell's case, it seemed the poisoning had worked both ways. The buried truth had corrupted the present, while the present had reached back to silence the past. The missing page from the porter's logbook, the half-erased notation in the bursar's ledger, the carefully neutral language of the master's revelations, all suggested a conspiracy, not of malice, but of maintenance, the ordinary corruption that occurs when institutions prioritize their own survival over individual justice. Yet someone had been watching St. Bartholomew's College in those crucial hours, someone who had departed when discovered, but remained long enough to suggest purpose rather than coincidence. As I walked back through Oxford's familiar streets, the phrase that had begun this investigation returned with renewed significance. He was already dead when they knocked. Perhaps Hartwell had indeed been dead long before his heart stopped beating, killed by decades of carrying other people's secrets, murdered by the slow poison of institutional loyalty. The question that remained was whether his death had been the final act of this long tragedy or merely its most recent scene. The morning train to London carried me through November's grey manuscript, its pages of fields and villages blurring past windows, streaked with rain that seemed to write its own melancholy commentary on the journey. Oxford's spires receded into memory, while ahead lay Bloomsbury, that particular quarter where scholarship meets commerce and both parties pretend the transaction involves something nobler than money. The rhythm of wheels crossing steel joints provided that species of solitude available only in railway carriages, where thoughts arrange themselves to match the measured percussion of travel. Marcus Finch's antiquarian shop occupied a narrow building that leaned against its neighbors like an elderly scholar seeking support. The painted sign above had faded beyond legibility, though the window display spoke eloquently of treasures within. Medieval manuscripts bound in leather that had acquired centuries of patina, maps of worlds that had ceased to exist when cartographers learned better. Inside, the air breathed with old paper and patient decay, carrying traces of leather oil, vellum, and that indefinable scent of age that transforms mere objects into repositories of human longing. Finch himself possessed the nervous energy of someone who had spent decades handling irreplaceable things while calculating their monetary worth. His fingers moved constantly, adjusting spectacles, straightening papers, touching book spines with unconscious affection. When I mentioned Professor Hartwell's name, those restless hands became suddenly still, a stillness that spoke more eloquently than any confession. He had indeed received Hartwell's call 3 evenings past, though his manner suggested the conversation had disturbed more than business equilibrium. The professor had been inquiring about manuscript authentication, specifically regarding a medieval document he described with the phrase that had lodged uncomfortably in Finch's memory, potentially explosive. Something that could rewrite college history Hartwell had claimed, though he remained frustratingly cryptic about specifics. The document was apparently a palimpsest, one text written over another with insufficient erasure of the original, the sort of manuscript that often contained the most intriguing secrets. Hartwell had promised to bring the item to London within days, speaking of it with reverent urgency, as if it were not merely paper and ink, but something living. He had mentioned authenticity not as a question, but as a weapon, and had spoken of the past with the particular bitterness of someone who had never been allowed to forget it. Finch's appointment book lay open on the counter, revealing Thursday's careful entry. Hartwell. Followed by smaller letters. St. Bart, the question mark suggesting uncertainty that had proved prophetic. The antiquarian's knowledge of Hartwell extended beyond professional relationship into scholarly gossip that circulates through London's book trade like persistent rumor. The professor had been a brilliant Cambridge student, destined for distinction until scandal intervened during his final year. Academic misconduct of some sort, though whether as perpetrator or victim had never been clarified. His graduation had been delayed, his reputation tarnished, his career trajectory permanently altered. Some stains, Finch observed with philosophical resignation, prove more permanent than others. There had been whispers about examination fraud involving several students and at least one junior faculty member, Cambridge handling the matter internally, which typically meant justice subordinated to institutional preservation. Hartwell had eventually completed his degree and found his Oxford position, but shadows had followed him throughout his academic career. The young man who had suffered delayed graduation at Cambridge had become the professor seeking access to sealed records at Oxford, a symmetry that suggested either coincidence or the sort of patient revenge that academic institutions occasionally inspire. The return journey provided time to contemplate the architecture of academic scandal and its peculiar longevity. Universities possess infinite capacity for transforming controversy into footnote, yet certain events resist comfortable burial. In my coat pocket, Finch's business card carried a penciled notation I had glimpsed in his ledger, CC014. The same initials that had appeared in the bursar's accounts, connecting threads that seemed to lead from Oxford's financial irregularities to London's manuscript trade. James Blackwood, the college archivist, greeted me with the particular nervousness of someone who had spent decades guarding secrets simultaneously worthless and priceless. His office occupied basement quarters where institutional memory lay filed in boxes that exhaled dust and disappointment. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in wan pallor while the air carried that distinctive scent of old paper and administrative anxiety. The 1974 files rested in a box marked with bureaucratic discretion that announced its own significance. Blackwood's hands trembled as he explained the circumstances that had led to their creation and subsequent sealing, academic misconduct involving several promising students and one junior faculty member handled internally to protect all parties concerned. The phrase had acquired the worn quality of something repeated so often it had lost connection to actual events. Young Adrian Hartwell appeared throughout these documents as both perpetrator and victim, his name surfacing in contexts suggesting complex motivations and divided loyalties. He had been accused of organizing examination fraud, yet statements from other students portrayed him as reluctant participant rather than mastermind. The resolution had been characteristically institutional. He would accept responsibility for delayed graduation while others continued their careers unimpeded, a sacrifice that purchased silence and preserved reputations. Most intriguingly, the files contained references to a document that had been confiscated during the investigation, something described only as insurance created by one of the participants. This item had been sealed separately, its current location noted merely as secure storage, a euphemism that could mean anything from college safe to deliberate destruction. As I studied these yellowed papers in their fluorescent purgatory, I began to understand the weight Professor Hartwell had carried for 30 years. He had been the designated scapegoat in a scandal requiring careful distribution of blame to prevent institutional embarrassment. Others had continued their careers while he bore the burden of delayed graduation and whispered suspicions. Yet something in the recent past had provided him with new evidence or renewed courage to challenge this ancient arrangement. The crossword clue that had haunted his final evening acquired fresh significance. Truth delayed. 7 letters remaining empty, waiting for justice to fill spaces that institutional discretion had left blank. In those basement archives, surrounded by carefully preserved evidence of academic compromise, I began to suspect that Professor Hartwell's death was not the beginning of the story, but its long-delayed conclusion. Standing among boxes that held the college's buried conscience, I reflected on the peculiar mathematics of institutional memory, how certain equations never balance, how some debts accumulate interest across decades until they can no longer be contained by administrative discretion. The phrase Dr. Vance had quoted echoed with uncomfortable resonance. Some truths are buried so deep they poison the very ground. The ground in question, it seemed, was the very foundation of St. Bartholomew's College, and the poison had been seeping for 30 years. Evening took possession of the college with that patient authority November understands. Lamps along the quad seeded small orioles on wet flagstones, while the chapel exhaled faint traces of old wax and older prayers. I found Eleanor Vance in her rooms above the cloister, the narrow staircase announcing every step as if rehearsing for confession. Her sitting room held tea, damp wool, and something faintly clinical that did not belong to Oxford, a sweetness that hovered between ward and apothecary, the same ghost of scent I'd encountered in Hartwell's study. She moved with that brittle economy of someone who knows collapse would be unbecoming. Books lined every available surface with the passionate disorder of genuine scholarship, while papers scattered across her desk suggested work interrupted by more pressing concerns than academic deadline. Her fingers traced edges without purpose, seeking comfort in familiar textures while preparing to abandon familiar silences. The confession arrived with understated precision, each sentence carefully constructed to acknowledge impropriety while asserting its irrelevance to his death. Her relationship with Professor Hartwell had extended beyond professional collaboration into territories that required careful navigation in an institution where personal entanglements attracted scrutiny like iron filings to magnets. They had been lovers for 2 years, she admitted, their affair complicated by age difference, college disapproval, and the peculiar challenges of maintaining intimacy within academic hierarchies. She spoke of him with the careful past tense of someone still adjusting to his absence, her voice carrying undertones of loss that extended beyond professional bereavement. Their relationship had been conducted with the discretion Oxford demands: separate public appearances, careful attention to propriety, the elaborate choreography required to maintain professional credibility while acknowledging private affection. Yet she described moments of genuine intimacy, late evenings in his study discussing medieval philosophy, walks through Christchurch Meadow where conversation moved seamlessly between scholarly debate and personal revelation. When at last she produced the manuscript he had entrusted to her keeping, she did so with the care of someone handling either explosive or relic. Brown paper, string, that faint library fragrance of dust's afterlife. The document had been hidden within the binding of another book, she explained, a 17th-century homily on penitence, swollen oddly along the spine and given away by its own excess weight. Hartwell had known what he was looking for before he knew where to find it. The manuscript itself possessed the tawny, animal plainness of old parchment. The first page opened on neat Gothic script, its letters compressed into dark thickets, rubricated initials murmuring pieties in red. The text declared itself a confession from the mid-14th century, the lament of a monk who had abetted sin among scholars and sought absolution while time yet tolerated him. I read the opening passage aloud, letting the Latin settle into the room's quiet. On second reading, time proved a patient examiner of texts. My eye caught the J that did not belong to medieval Latin's alphabet, the comfortable comma that broke sentences where such pauses were not yet fashionable. A word chose integrity when its Middle English cousin honesty would have stood at the gate, while the S wrote itself short as if it had mislaid its long shadow somewhere in the 18th century. These are the little modernities that creep in like drafts beneath doors. I turned the page toward the insufficient light and felt the quiet pleasure of discovery that sometimes accompanies sorrow. Paper, not skin, the faint echo of chain lines crossing the sheet at customary intervals, a watermark just shy of legible when coaxed toward the window's meager glow. No 14th century monk had purchased laid paper from a 19th century mill. The red initial bled at its edges when I touched it with dampened finger. Vermilion does not run, but aniline dyes do, and modern inks carry their own ruin. The whole confession, with its pious modesties and carefully placed remorse, was a modern contrivance expertly costumed. Yet this was no mere academic exercise in forgery. Embedded within the Latin were references that echoed more recent events. Phrases about examination fraud disguised as theological discussion of moral testing, passages about institutional corruption masked as commentary on ecclesiastical politics. The document was indeed a confession, but one belonging to the 20th century rather than the 14th, a coded account of the 1974 scandal. I traced the initials that adorned each section, noticing how their alphabet marched down the margins with courtiers' obedience. At the head of the first paragraph, S for the second, H for the third. B, then O, then R, then T, then H. The confession pretended to be about sin, but its illuminated capitals whispered a different catechism. Ashworth. It was a childish device and therefore dangerous. Mature conspiracies disdain such flourish, but someone who needed insurance might relish the signature's double life. Eleanor watched me reading what she could not yet bear to know. He thought it would prove what happened, she said, her voice acquiring the blankness people use for pain. The forgery had been created as insurance by one of the original conspirators from 1974, she explained. Someone who understood that evidence must sometimes be preserved in forms that escape casual detection. It had lain hidden for decades, waiting for someone with sufficient motivation to deploy it. Hartwell's discovery had consumed him with the particular obsession that characterizes scholars who encounter evidence challenging accepted narratives. His plan for the faculty meeting had been devastating in its simplicity. Present the manuscript as a medieval discovery requiring scholarly attention, then gradually reveal its true nature and contemporary relevance. The revelation would have destroyed several careers while vindicating his own reputation, transforming him from scandal's victim into its exposer. The crossword that had haunted his final evening suddenly acquired crystalline significance. She made a small sound that might have been laughter when I mentioned it. He had circled that clue weeks ago and kept it in his wallet like a joke told too often. Truth delayed, 7 letters. He didn't fill it in because he said it would only count if the letters were earned. Justice fit the grid as snugly as fate. His final bitter commentary on institutional priorities that subordinate individual fairness to collective preservation. Standing in that book-lined office while rain worried at medieval stones beyond the windows, I began to understand the architecture of revenge that had consumed Hartwell's final months. The manuscript represented more than historical curiosity or academic vindication. It was a weapon carefully preserved for 3 decades, waiting for deployment against those who had escaped justice through institutional protection. Yet something in Dr. Vance's manner suggested knowledge extending beyond what she had revealed. Her familiarity with the manuscript's contents, her immediate understanding of its significance, her careful phrasing when describing Hartwell's discovery, all suggested involvement preceding his revelation. On her sideboard, I noticed a compact plastic case with bland pharmaceutical typography, its lid ajar as if asked something it could not answer. The medicinal sweetness that had puzzled me in his study lingered here too, faint but persistent. The phrase that had begun this investigation returned with renewed significance. He was already dead when they knocked. Perhaps Hartwell had indeed been dead long before his heart stopped beating, killed by the weight of carrying other people's secrets, murdered by the slow poison of institutional injustice. The manuscript in my hands represented both his vindication and his death warrant, a document promising justice while ensuring its bearer would not survive to witness its delivery. As I prepared to leave, tucking the wrapped manuscript beneath my coat, I reflected on the peculiar mathematics of institutional memory. How certain equations never balance, how some debts accumulate interest across decades until they can no longer be contained by administrative discretion. In Oxford's ancient corridors, where past and present maintain their eternal conversation, some secrets prove too dangerous for their keepers to survive their revelation. Justice, I thought, fitting the letters into Hartwell's grid as I crossed the stone. Truth delayed may be justice finally, or merely justice late enough to resemble something else entirely. The medieval monk whose confession had been forged to conceal modern sins would have understood the irony. Truth, like justice, arrives on its own schedule, indifferent to human convenience or survival. Evening had settled over the college with November's particular authority, transforming familiar courtyards into repositories of shadow and memory. The master's lodging exhaled, centuries of accumulated decisions, its air seasoned with beeswax, leather bindings, and that indefinable scent of institutional power exercised quietly behind oak doors. Rain composed its eternal commentary against leaded panes while portraits of former masters maintained their painted vigil, each face bearing the particular expression of men who had learned to transform scandal into footnote through the alchemy of time and discretion. Dr. Victoria Ashworth received me with the composed wariness of someone who had spent decades perfecting diplomatic conversation while preparing for this inevitable reckoning. Her study arranged itself around us with the careful precision of a woman accustomed to being observed by invisible committees, every book and paper positioned to suggest scholarly gravitas rather than personal vulnerability. Yet something in her bearing suggested the performance was growing tiresome, as if 30 years of careful construction were finally demanding their accounting. I placed the wrapped manuscript upon her desk with deliberate ceremony, allowing its presence to announce itself before words became necessary. The brown paper and string possessed that old-fashioned dignity of secrets preserved, and her eyes fixed upon the package with recognition that preceded explanation. She touched it with one finger, testing whether it might prove illusory, then withdrew her hand as though the paper had burned. The confession emerged with archaeological patience, each layer revealing deeper strata of compromise and calculation. She had been a junior research fellow in 1974, brilliant and ambitious, working alongside 3 graduate students whose academic futures seemed assured by talent and institutional favor. Adrian Hartwell had been among them, perhaps the most gifted, certainly the most idealistic, possessed of that dangerous combination of intellectual rigor and moral certainty that makes young scholars simultaneously invaluable and inconvenient. I unwrapped the manuscript as she spoke, laying bare the carefully forged confession with its pseudo-medieval script. The technical analysis I had conducted earlier acquired fresh significance as she acknowledged its creation. The comma that betrayed modern nervousness to pause where medieval's preferred momentum, the watermarked paper from a 19th century mill masquerading as 14th century vellum, the aniline dyes that bled when touched with dampened finger, all testified to a document crafted not for historical inquiry, but for contemporary leverage. The examination fraud had begun almost accidentally, she explained, a moment of weakness that expanded into systematic deception through the peculiar momentum that characterizes institutional corruption. One student's illness had prompted another to share answers. Success had encouraged repetition. Repetition had demanded organization. Before any of them fully understood what they had created, they found themselves operating a network that extended beyond friendship into conspiracy. Hartwell had been the reluctant participant, drawn into their arrangement through loyalty rather than greed, participating more from desire to protect his friends than advance his own interests. Yet when discovery became inevitable, as it always does in academic institutions where secrets circulate like gossip and gossip eventually reaches administrative attention, someone had to bear primary responsibility for the collective failure. The arrangement that followed possessed the elegant cruelty that characterizes institutional solutions to embarrassing problems. Hartwell would accept full responsibility for the fraud. His graduation would be delayed while investigations proceeded, and his academic record would carry permanent notation of misconduct. In exchange, the others would continue their careers unimpeded, their reputations preserved through his sacrifice. It was presented as temporary inconvenience rather than permanent martyrdom, though everyone involved understood the true mathematics of academic scandal. The forged manuscript had been her creation, she admitted, with the particular shame reserved for crimes requiring genuine talent to execute. Trained in paleography and experienced in medieval Latin, she had possessed both skill and access necessary to create convincing historical forgery. The document served as insurance against future betrayal, ensuring that if any party violated their agreement, evidence existed to implicate them all equally. The initialed sections, Ashworth descending the page like a rubricated staircase, had been a moment of youthful hubris that had haunted her ever since. For 30 years, this arrangement had held with remarkable stability. Hartwell had completed his delayed degree and found his Oxford position, though advancement came slowly and recognition remained elusive. Meanwhile, she had risen through academic ranks with steady determination, her reputation unmarked by scandal, her career trajectory unimpeded by institutional memory. The manuscript had remained hidden, a sleeping weapon that required no deployment while all parties honored their original agreement. Recently, however, Hartwell had discovered new evidence that fundamentally altered the equation they had maintained for 3 decades. Documents from the original investigation, previously sealed, had become accessible through changes in university policy regarding historical records. These materials revealed that his role in the fraud had been significantly less central than the official record suggested, while her own involvement had been more extensive and calculating than anyone had acknowledged. The revelation had consumed him with the particular obsession that characterizes those who discover they have been systematically deceived by people they trusted. His planned faculty meeting would have presented this evidence alongside the forged manuscript, creating a devastating narrative of institutional corruption and personal betrayal. Her career would have ended in disgrace, while his reputation achieved posthumous vindication, a reversal of fortune that would have satisfied both justice and revenge. As she spoke, I noticed her hands maintaining steady contact with the desk's surface, as if drawing strength from its solid reality, while her carefully constructed world dissolved around her. On the windowsill, a parking permit from city cars caught my attention. The same service mentioned in the bursar's ledger, dated the afternoon before Hartwell's death. When I mentioned this detail, her response carried the tiniest wrong note in an otherwise expertly played symphony. She offered one final contribution wrapped in something like pity. Hartwell had ordered wine from the lodge that last evening, she revealed. The house claret he always mocked for its mediocrity. When a man alters such a habit, even trivially, something is afoot. A man who distrusts the house claret would not choose it on a night he intended to savor victory, unless he intended nothing at all beyond ritual. Standing in that book-lined office where she had spent years accumulating the trappings of academic success, I began to understand the architecture of resentment that had shaped both their lives. Hartwell had carried the burden of false guilt, while she enjoyed the privileges his sacrifice had purchased. The weight of this knowledge had poisoned every achievement, every recognition, every moment of professional satisfaction. He had become the curator of her success, maintaining silence that enabled her advancement while his own potential remained forever diminished. The crossword clue that had haunted his final evening acquired crystalline significance. Truth delayed, 7 letters. Justice fit the grid as snugly as fate, his final, bitter commentary on institutional priorities that subordinate individual fairness to collective preservation. He had pursued his truth with the patience of a medieval scholar, allowing it to ripen over decades, believing that its eventual unveiling would bring not merely vindication, but public retribution. The phrase that had begun this investigation returned with renewed significance. He was already dead when they knocked. Perhaps Hartwell had indeed died long before his heart stopped beating, killed by the slow poison of carrying guilt that belonged to others, murdered by institutional injustice that transformed victims into scapegoats and scapegoats into curators of others' success. Yet something in Dr. Ashworth's manner suggested this confession, complete as it appeared, remained incomplete in ways that mattered. Her careful phrasing, her measured revelations, her strategic deployment of guilt and explanation all suggested performance rather than genuine unburdening. The manuscript lay between us like evidence in a trial that had been postponed for 30 years, its forged confession finally prepared to serve its original purpose. As I prepared to leave, tucking the wrapped document beneath my coat, I reflected on the peculiar mathematics of institutional memory, how certain equations never balance, how some debts accumulate interest across decades until they can no longer be contained by administrative discretion. The truth of 1974 had finally emerged, but the truth of Hartwell's death remained as elusive as justice itself, delayed but not yet delivered. Oxford at night possessed that particular quality of listening to its own breathing. Slow, damp, faintly ecclesiastical. Rain composed its eternal commentary against the diamond panes of my study, while a single lamp carved shadows from the accumulated darkness. I had opened negotiations with both Bottle and Puccini before abandoning both for the international dial tone. That thin wire strung across continents like a conversation between estranged consciences. The number for Melbourne lay in Lewis's careful script beside Hartwell's unfinished crossword, those 7 empty squares still waiting for their answer, like small graves requiring consecration. Dr. Michael Hartwell answered with the measured precision of a man accustomed to delivering unwelcome diagnoses across impossible distances. His voice carried sunrise at its edges, while Oxford settled into evening's familiar melancholy, a temporal displacement that seemed appropriate for brothers who had spent decades occupying different zones of grief and forgiveness. He had been expecting my call, he admitted, though expectation had brought no comfort. Official notifications traveled faster than human communication across the Commonwealth's administrative networks, delivering death with bureaucratic efficiency while leaving emotional reckoning to follow at its own pace. Their final conversation had lasted precisely 47 minutes, he confirmed, though those minutes had contained more honesty than their previous decade of careful correspondence. Adrian had not telephoned seeking reconciliation, as familial optimism might suggest, but confession, not of guilt, but of intended revenge. He had discovered evidence that would finally vindicate his reputation while destroying those who had purchased their success through his sacrifice. The faculty meeting he had convened would serve simultaneously as tribunal, courtroom, and execution ground for colleagues who had escaped justice through his enforced silence. Michael spoke of his brother with the particular weariness of someone who had watched a brilliant mind consume itself with resentment disguised as principle. Adrian had detailed his plan with methodical precision. The forged manuscript would be presented as historical discovery before its contemporary relevance became apparent. The sealed 1974 records would provide corroborating evidence. The assembled faculty would witness not merely academic vindication, but public humiliation of those who had built careers upon his ruin. He had even mentioned the crossword clue, that bitter joke he intended to complete with justice at the moment of his triumph. 7 letters for truth delayed, finally earning their resolution. Yet something in Adrian's tone had disturbed his brother beyond the obvious implications of academic scandal. There had been finality to his revelations that suggested preparation for consequences extending beyond professional embarrassment. He had spoken of justice with the intensity of someone who understood that truth's emergence might require personal sacrifice, that some victories could only be purchased through the victor's destruction. At one point, searching for words, Adrian had laughed and said that by the time they knock, I shall already be dead. An academic's gallows humor that now resonated with uncomfortable prophecy. The medical details that emerged from our conversation possessed significance extending far beyond fraternal concern into forensic territory. Adrian had been managing a mild cardiac arrhythmia for several years with carefully calibrated medication, digitalis compounds and beta blockers prescribed in precise doses to maintain cardiac stability without inducing dependency. The prescription was conservative and methodical, reflecting medical caution appropriate to his age and condition. Most significantly, these medications had been collected from the college pharmacy only days before his death, yet none had been discovered in his study or personal effects. Michael's clinical training provided context that transformed missing pills from oversight into evidence. The medications in question were precisely the substances that, in excessive doses, could induce cardiac arrest while leaving minimal forensic traces. A physician familiar with their properties could calculate dosages that would prove fatal while appearing to result from natural cardiac stress. The missing bottles suggested not carelessness, but deliberate removal by someone who understood their lethal potential when administered improperly. Lewis arrived as I concluded the Melbourne conversation, his notebook filled with observations that provided terrestrial complement to the brothers' transatlantic testimony. The porter's enhanced recollections had yielded crucial details about the morning of discovery. Dr. Vance had been observed entering the college unusually early, approximately 6:30, carrying what appeared to be a medical bag. When questioned, she had explained her presence as concern for Professor Hartwell, claiming he had forgotten his heart medication and she was delivering his morning doses. This explanation possessed surface plausibility while concealing deeper inconsistencies. Hartwell's routine was legendary among college staff. He arrived at his study precisely at 8 each morning, never earlier, never later. Dr. Vance's claimed concern about forgotten medication would have been more credibly addressed through telephone contact rather than personal delivery at such an hour. Most significantly, her medical bag suggested preparation extending beyond simple pharmaceutical delivery into territory requiring specialized equipment. The porter had noted additional details that acquired significance through accumulation. Dr. Vance had possessed her own key to the building, unusual for research assistants, but explainable through her extended collaboration with Hartwell. She had remained approximately 90 minutes before departing. Unusual for someone delivering medication to a colleague who had not yet arrived. Her manner had been described as focused rather than concerned, businesslike rather than worried. The demeanor of someone executing a plan rather than responding to emergency. As I reconstructed the evening's chronology, a pattern emerged, suggesting premeditation rather than spontaneous action. Hartwell had spent his final hours preparing for triumph, organizing evidence, rehearsing revelations, anticipating restoration of his reputation through others' destruction. Yet someone had known of his plans sufficiently in advance to prepare countermeasures. The missing medication indicated not natural death but carefully induced cardiac arrest, administered by someone with both medical knowledge and intimate access to his routine. The pharmaceutical evidence possessed particular significance when considered alongside Dr. Vance's professional background. Her medical training, though focused on research rather than clinical practice, would have provided sufficient knowledge of cardiac medications to understand their lethal potential when administered improperly. Her access to Hartwell's study, her familiarity with his habits, her emotional investment in his welfare, all combined to create both opportunity and motive for intervention. Yet the emotional mathematics remained troublingly complex. If Dr. Vance had indeed murdered Hartwell, her motivation extended beyond simple self-preservation into territory requiring deeper psychological analysis. She had loved him by her own admission and had supported his quest for vindication even while understanding its potential consequences. What transformation could convert love into lethal action, support into betrayal? Perhaps the answer lay in the very intensity of their relationship, love corrupted by institutional pressures that subordinated individual welfare to collective preservation. Standing in that silent study where Hartwell had spent his final hours, I found myself contemplating the architecture of betrayal that characterized this case. The 1974 scandal had begun with friendship corrupted by expedience, continued with sacrifice disguised as justice, and culminated in love transformed into murder. Each relationship had been poisoned by institutional forces that demanded silence over truth, preservation over justice. The crossword clue that had haunted Hartwell's final evening acquired fresh poignancy. Truth delayed. 7 letters. Justice fitted the grid perfectly, yet justice seemed as elusive as ever. His planned revelation would have destroyed careers while vindicating his reputation, but someone had ensured that truth would remain permanently delayed. Its bearer silenced before his testimony could be delivered. The phrase that had begun this investigation returned with renewed significance. He was already dead when they knocked. Perhaps Hartwell had indeed been dead long before his colleagues arrived, killed not by cardiac arrest, but by the weight of carrying secrets that had finally become unbearable. The missing medication suggested that someone had merely accelerated a process that institutional injustice had initiated 30 years earlier, transforming delayed justice into permanent silence through the precise application of medical knowledge and emotional betrayal. November, rain composed its eternal commentary against the diamond panes of my study, while a single lamp carved shadows from the accumulated darkness. The crossword lay spread upon my desk like evidence awaiting judgment, its black and white squares offering their own meditation on the relationship between pattern and meaning. I had removed it from Hartwell's study with the reverence reserved for documents that might prove either revelatory or merely tragic. In my experience, the distinction often emerged only through patient contemplation. The puzzle possessed that familiar architecture of the Times crossword, symmetrical, challenging, occasionally perverse in its wordplay. Hartwell had completed most clues with his characteristic precision. Small letters fitted neatly into their designated squares with the methodical care of a man who preferred order to chaos. Yet, as I studied the grid under the focused light of my desk lamp, patterns emerged that extended beyond mere vocabulary into territory approaching deliberate communication. The variation was subtle, barely perceptible under normal lighting, but unmistakable when examined with the magnifying glass I kept for such purposes. Most entries appeared in Hartwell's characteristic blue-black fountain pen, that deep, saturated color that spoke of careful instrument selection and scholarly habit. Yet several answers had been written in distinctly different ink, a lighter, more purple ballpoint that pressed deeper into the paper's grain, suggesting urgency rather than leisure. The substituted answers disrupted what appeared to be Hartwell's original pattern. Reading down the first letters of his completed clues revealed a chilling acrostic. Betrayal awaits justice. The construction was deliberate, requiring selection of specific answers to achieve the desired message, choosing betrayer over traitor for one who sells out, selecting awaits rather than expects for looks forward to. These choices suggested a mind more concerned with hidden communication than crossword elegance. The later editions, written in that foreign ballpoint, had corrupted this message. Betrayal became betrayed through alteration of the final answer. Awaits was changed to awards, transforming coherent warning into near nonsense. Yet the perpetrator had left one clue conspicuously untouched. 17 down, truth delayed. 7. Those 7 empty squares that had haunted Hartwell's final evening. The answer, justice, remained unwritten, as if whoever had tampered with the puzzle recognized this particular clue's significance and chose to preserve its eloquent silence. Lewis arrived with testimony that fundamentally challenged our understanding of the evening's chronology. The college chaplain, Giles Morton, possessed that particular clerical precision that makes certain witnesses invaluable to criminal investigation. His routine never varied. Evening prayers concluded at 9:30. Administrative duties occupied him until 11, followed by a constitutional through the college grounds before retiring at 12:30. Morton had observed lights in Hartwell's study window at approximately 20 minutes past midnight, the distinctive glow of the desk lamp rather than overhead lighting. This observation contradicted Dr. Whitmore's revised estimate of death occurring before midnight, creating a temporal impossibility that demanded explanation. If Hartwell had died before midnight, who had been operating the desk lamp 20 minutes later? The chaplain's account possessed additional significance when combined with his knowledge of Hartwell's habits. Professor Hartwell was legendarily punctual, retiring precisely at midnight and rarely working past that hour. The burning light suggested either a dramatic departure from routine or the presence of someone else entirely. These revelations, the altered crossword, the timeline contradiction, the missing glasses and medication, began to arrange themselves into a pattern that spoke of calculated deception rather than natural discovery. Someone had access to Hartwell's study after his death, had used the intervening hours to stage the scene with meticulous attention to detail. The missing reading glasses, which Dr. Vance had insisted Hartwell never removed while working, represented deliberate removal rather than oversight. Without them, he could not have completed the fine work of crossword solving or manuscript translation that supposedly occupied his final hours. Their absence suggested someone had tidied the scene, removing evidence that might contradict the narrative of natural death. The missing heart medication told a more sinister story. Hartwell's brother had confirmed these carefully prescribed doses had been collected days before his death, yet none were found in his study or personal effects. The medications in question, digitalis, compounds, and beta blockers, were precisely the substances that, in excessive doses, could induce cardiac arrest while leaving minimal forensic traces. Standing in that lamp-lit study where academic ambition had collided with institutional preservation, I began to understand the true chronology of Hartwell's final hours. The phrase that had begun this investigation acquired crystalline significance. He was already dead when they knocked. The statement was literally accurate, yet the precision of the timing, the theatrical nature of the discovery, the careful arrangement of evidence all suggested that his death had been neither natural nor spontaneous. The knocking that had discovered Hartwell's body was not spontaneous discovery, but carefully orchestrated performance. Someone had known of his death hours before the official discovery, had used the intervening time to alter evidence, establish false timelines, and prepare alibis. The early morning arrival with medical supplies, the lights observed past midnight, the altered crossword, all suggested planning that extended beyond spontaneous action into premeditated murder. The killer had remained to stage the scene, arranging papers with suspicious neatness, removing incriminating evidence, corrupting the crossword to obscure its hidden message. The lights observed past midnight marked not Hartwell's final hours, but his murderer's careful preparation of the performance that would follow. When colleagues came knocking for their meeting, they would discover not merely a death, but a carefully constructed tableau designed to suggest natural causes while concealing deliberate murder. The puzzle lay before me like a confession written in code, its altered answers testifying to intelligence corrupted by desperation. Someone had understood Hartwell's methods well enough to recognize his hidden message, had possessed sufficient medical knowledge to induce cardiac arrest, had maintained emotional composure necessary to stage elaborate deception. The combination of intimate knowledge, professional capability, and psychological ruthlessness suggested a killer whose relationship with the victim extended far beyond casual acquaintance, into territories of trust and betrayal. In Oxford's ancient corridors, where past and present maintained their eternal conversation, some secrets proved too dangerous for their keepers to survive their revelation. Hartwell's crossword had been intended as his final communication, a puzzle whose solution would point toward justice delayed but not denied. Instead, it had become evidence of justice murdered, its message corrupted by the very person he had trusted with his most dangerous secrets. The empty squares of 17 Down seemed to mock both Hartwell's quest for vindication and his killer's attempt at concealment. 7 letters for truth delayed, still waiting for their answer, still demanding their justice. In the altered ink and corrupted acrostic, I read not merely evidence of tampering, but a killer's signature written in the very medium of their victim's final intellectual pleasure. November rain had ceased its patient commentary, leaving Oxford wrapped in that particular silence that follows revelation, not empty, but gravid with understanding finally achieved. I sat in my study as the city settled into its nocturnal rhythms, the accumulated evidence arranged before me like fragments of a moral archaeology. The crossword lay beside the forged manuscript, both documents testifying to intelligence corrupted by institutional pressures that transform love into the most calculated form of betrayal. The phrase that had haunted this investigation from its beginning possessed a precision that extended far beyond casual observation. He was already dead when they knocked. Not discovery, but announcement. Not surprise, but the final act of an elaborate performance that had required hours of careful preparation. If Professor Adrian Hartwell was indeed dead when his colleagues came knocking, then someone had known of his death long before its official revelation and had used those intervening hours to construct an intricate deception. Dr. Eleanor Vance's account of discovering Hartwell's body had possessed the polished quality of testimony rehearsed in advance. Her initial description had been remarkably complete for someone supposedly overwhelmed by shock. The precise position of his body, the arrangement of papers, the immediate assumption of cardiac arrest. Such clinical observation suggested medical training applied to forensic assessment rather than emotional response to unexpected death. The medicinal scent that Lewis had noted in Hartwell's study acquired devastating significance when considered alongside her early morning presence in the college. She had been observed entering at 6:30, carrying what appeared to be a medical bag, claiming concern for Hartwell's forgotten medication. Yet Hartwell's legendary punctuality made such early presence impossible. He never arrived before 8 o'clock, a routine known throughout the college. Her explanation had possessed surface plausibility while concealing deeper inconsistencies. The medical bag suggested preparation extending beyond simple pharmaceutical delivery into territory requiring specialized equipment. Her 90-minute presence in the building could not be explained by medication delivery to a colleague who had not yet arrived. Most significantly, the faint medicinal sweetness that had lingered in both locations testified to recent pharmaceutical presence. Not antiseptic cleanliness, but the complex fragrance of concentrated medications transferred from her supplies to the crime scene. The scene in Hartwell's study had been meticulously composed to suggest natural death while concealing evidence of murder. The suspicious neatness of his papers, arranged with geometric precision that contradicted the chaos typically associated with sudden cardiac distress, suggested tidying by someone intimately familiar with his organizational habits. Scholars experiencing medical emergencies do not pause to arrange their work. They collapse among the natural disorder of interrupted thought. The missing reading glasses provided crucial evidence of post-mortem interference. Colleagues insisted Hartwell never remove them while working, yet they were absent from his desk where close translation work lay unfinished. Their disappearance suggested deliberate removal to eliminate evidence that might contradict the narrative of natural death. A man could not have completed intricate crossword solving without his essential visual aids. The altered crossword provided the most damning evidence of calculated deception. Hartwell's original acrostic, "Betrayal awaits justice," had been corrupted through strategic substitutions using different ink. The ballpoint pen pressed deeper into the paper's grain than his characteristic fountain pen, suggesting urgency and unfamiliarity with his writing instruments. Yet the perpetrator had possessed sufficient knowledge of his methods to recognize the hidden message, indicating intimate familiarity with his intellectual habits. Most tellingly, she had left one clue conspicuously untouched: 17 down, truth delayed. 7. The answer, justice, remained unwritten, as if whoever had tampered with the puzzle recognized this particular clue's significance and chose to preserve its eloquent silence, perhaps as unconscious acknowledgement of the grim irony that justice would indeed be permanently delayed. Dr. Vance's training in medical research, though focused on theoretical rather than clinical applications, had provided sufficient knowledge of cardiac medications to understand their lethal potential when administered improperly. Hartwell's missing heart medication, digitalis compounds and beta blockers collected days before his death, were precisely the substances that could induce cardiac arrest while leaving minimal forensic traces. The method possessed elegant simplicity that spoke to both medical expertise and intimate knowledge of the victim's routine. His evening wine, ordered from the lodge in an unusual departure from his typical abstemiousness, had provided the perfect delivery mechanism for fatal dosages of his own medication. The timing had been calculated to ensure death occurred during hours when discovery would be delayed, providing opportunity for extensive scene staging and evidence manipulation. Standing in that corridor before dawn, I had Lewis knock twice on Hartwell's door while I listened to the sound's journey through the building's ancient architecture. The echo returned altered, quilted by fabric and paper, the acoustic signature of a room tidied beyond normal use. The study had heard those knocks with the dull indifference of a space that had already concluded its meaning. The chaplain's testimony about lights burning past midnight now acquired crucial significance. If Dr. Whitmore's estimate placed death around midnight, who had been operating the desk lamp 20 minutes later? The answer was Dr. Vance, completing the meticulous work of staging, arranging papers, removing glasses, tampering with the crossword, ensuring every detail supported the narrative of natural death. The knocking that had discovered Hartwell's body represented the culmination of carefully orchestrated performance. She had already entered hours earlier, had found or created the scene she would later officially discover, had used the intervening time to establish false timelines and prepare her emotional responses. When colleagues arrived for their faculty meeting, they encountered not spontaneous discovery, but rehearsed revelation. The emotional mathematics that had transformed Dr. Vance from loving companion into calculating killer possessed the tragic complexity that characterizes the most devastating betrayals. Hartwell's planned revelation would have destroyed not only Dr. Ashworth's career, but her own professional future through association. Her involvement in the 1974 investigation, initially as junior researcher, had provided her with knowledge that made her complicit in the institutional cover-up. The profound intellectual arrogance required for such a crime was breathtaking, not only to commit murder, but to orchestrate the aftermath with clinical precision, manipulating every element of the scene to tell a false story, corrupting the victim's final defiant message. This spoke of a mind both brilliant and terrifyingly ruthless, one that had been intimately familiar with Hartwell's habits, his intellectual pursuits, his very rhythms of life and thought. As I sat in my lamp-lit study, contemplating the architecture of deception that had shaped this case, I understood that the phrase, "he was already dead when they knocked," carried multiple layers of meaning. Hartwell had been physically dead, yes, but also intellectually and emotionally murdered by the very forces he had sought to expose. The knocking was not the sound of discovery, but the final, ironic applause for a meticulously executed deception. The crossword clue that had haunted his final evening acquired fresh poignancy. Truth delayed, 7 letters. Justice fitted the grid perfectly, yet justice seemed as elusive as ever. His planned revelation would have restored his reputation while destroying others, but someone had ensured that truth would remain permanently delayed, its bearer silenced before his testimony could be delivered. In Oxford's ancient corridors, where past and present maintained their eternal conversation, some secrets proved too dangerous for their keepers to survive their revelation. Dr. Vance had chosen to preserve what could be saved: her career, her future, her carefully constructed identity, even at the cost of the man she claimed to love. Love corrupted by institutional pressures had become the instrument of the most calculated betrayal, transforming mercy into murder and devotion into the perfect crime. The empty squares of 17 down seemed to mock both Hartwell's quest for vindication and his killer's attempt at concealment. 7 letters for truth delayed, still waiting for their answer, still demanding their justice. Yet in the silence of those unfilled spaces, I heard the sound of deception finally exposed. Not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of evidence that reveals how love, when corrupted by fear and institutional loyalty, can become the most dangerous weapon of all. November rain had settled over Oxford with that particular authority of weather that understands its own permanence, transforming familiar courtyards into repositories of shadow and accumulated memory. I had arranged to meet Dr. Eleanor Vance in a small seminar room above the cloister, a space that breathed with chalk dust, damp plaster, and the exhausted breath of decades of academic argument. The windows looked down onto quadrangle lawn, bruised by drizzle, and somewhere in the building's depths, a door complained softly each time the porter passed on his rounds. The evidence lay spread upon the oak table with deliberate ceremony: the altered crossword with its corrupted acrostic, the forged manuscript with its pseudo-medieval confession, the pharmaceutical records documenting Hartwell's missing medication. Each item possessed its own accusatory weight, but together they composed an indictment that spoke not merely of murder, but of betrayal so comprehensive it encompassed both personal and professional dimensions of trust. She entered with that brittle precision characteristic of minds operating under extreme duress, her movements carrying the medicinal sweetness that had haunted both crime scenes, not antiseptic cleanliness, but the complex fragrance of concentrated pharmaceuticals that had become her unwitting signature. Her hands moved constantly, adjusting papers, touching book spines, seeking comfort in familiar textures while preparing to abandon familiar silences. The crossword provided the most damning testimony. I traced the altered answers with my finger, noting how the ballpoint pen had pressed deeper into the paper's grain than Hartwell's characteristic fountain pen. The original message, "Betrayal awaits justice," had been corrupted through strategic substitutions, transforming coherent warning into near nonsense. Yet she had left one clue conspicuously untouched: 17 down, truth delayed. 7. Those 7 empty squares that seemed to mock both Hartwell's quest for vindication and her attempt at concealment. I began not with accusation, but with time, the chaplain's midnight lamp, the porter's recollection of her early arrival with medical supplies, the missing glasses that Hartwell never removed while working. The pharmaceutical evidence possessed particular significance when considered alongside her professional background. Digitalis compounds and beta blockers collected in Hartwell's name, identical substances dispensed under her research protocol, the timings overlapping like ill-matched harmonies. Her composure began to fracture like ice under spring pressure, the careful mask of scholarly grief dissolving to reveal something more primitive beneath. Not remorse, but the particular terror of someone who had gambled everything on a single deception and watched it systematically dismantled. When she spoke, her voice carried the hollow quality of someone who had rehearsed confession without ever believing it would be required. The revelation emerged with archaeological patience, each layer exposing deeper strata of compromise and calculation. Her involvement in the 1974 investigation had been more extensive than anyone had acknowledged, not merely as junior researcher, but as active participant in the institutional cover-up that had destroyed Hartwell's early career while preserving others. She had helped craft the narrative that transformed examination fraud into individual misconduct, had assisted in orchestrating the sacrifice that purchased collective silence through his enforced disgrace. Hartwell's planned faculty meeting would have destroyed not only Dr. Ashworth's career, but her own professional future through association. The forged manuscript, with its coded references to the original scandal, would have exposed her role in the investigation that had buried truth beneath institutional preservation. Her medical research position, her academic reputation, her carefully constructed identity, all would have crumbled beneath the weight of revelations that had waited 30 years for their moment of emergence. "There are doses that comfort and doses that command silence," she said with clinical precision, "and physicians know the difference because they must." The method she described possessed elegant simplicity. Hartwell's evening wine, ordered from the lodge in an unusual departure from his typical abstemiousness, had provided the perfect delivery mechanism for fatal dosages of his own medication. She had calculated the timing to ensure death occurred during hours when discovery would be delayed, providing opportunity for extensive scene staging and evidence manipulation. The knocking that had discovered Hartwell's body represented the culmination of carefully orchestrated performance rather than spontaneous discovery. She had entered the building hours before the official revelation, using her medical knowledge to induce cardiac arrest through overdose of his digitalis compounds. He had opened the door with the expression scholars reserve for footnotes that overturn argument, believing her concern for his forgotten medication to be genuine devotion rather than calculated murder. She waited as his breath found that unevenness she knew from the literature, then removed the glasses he would not need and placed them in her bag. An absent-minded librarian in a room of consequences. The intervening time had been spent in meticulous preparation, arranging papers with suspicious neatness, corrupting the crossword to obscure its hidden message, ensuring every detail supported the narrative of natural death. "You changed the ink," I observed, watching her weigh whether to ask how I knew. Ballpoint presses into the paper's grain, a fountain pen lays itself on the surface. She accepted this small defeat with patient economy, admitting she had tampered with his final communication because pride cannot resist footnotes even in murder. Yet she had left the crucial clue untouched, perhaps sensing that writing justice would summon judgment she was not prepared to face. As her confession continued, I recognized the same intellectual arrogance that had originally corrupted the 1974 investigation, now brought full circle in murder. The profound hubris required to orchestrate such deception was breathtaking, not only to commit the crime, but to manipulate every element of its aftermath, corrupting the victim's final defiant message while maintaining the facade of grieving colleague. "He meant to write justice," she said, and I heard the smallest hitch of envy in her voice. "He meant to write justice and watch it wound." But she had refused to let his 20-year grudge end her like misfiled data, had chosen institutional preservation over individual justice, professional survival over personal loyalty. The emotional mathematics that had driven her to murder possessed the tragic complexity that characterizes the most devastating betrayals. Love corrupted by fear, devotion transformed into calculation, intimacy perverted into opportunity for the perfect crime. In her breakdown, I saw reflected the moral corruption that had characterized this case from its beginning, the way institutional pressures transform individual conscience into collective complicity, how the desire to preserve reputation can justify the most profound betrayals. The 1974 scandal had begun with friendship corrupted by expedience, continued with sacrifice disguised as justice, and culminated in love transformed into murder. Standing in that book-lined room where academic argument had been reduced to confession, I reflected on the peculiar mathematics of institutional memory. How certain equations never balance, how some debts accumulate interest across decades until they can no longer be contained by administrative discretion. Dr. Vance had chosen to preserve what could be saved, even at the cost of the man she claimed to love, transforming mercy into murder and devotion into the most calculated form of betrayal. The crossword clue that had haunted Hartwell's final evening acquired its ultimate significance. Truth delayed, 7 letters. Justice fitted the grid perfectly, yet justice seemed as elusive as ever. His quest for vindication had been silenced by the very person he had trusted with his most dangerous secrets, his final message corrupted by the woman who had calculated the precise dosage required to stop his heart while claiming to love him. As I prepared to leave that study where academic ambition had collided with personal betrayal, the phrase that had begun this investigation returned with renewed significance. He was already dead when they knocked. Perhaps Hartwell had indeed been dead long before his heart stopped beating, killed by the weight of carrying others' secrets, murdered by institutional injustice that transformed victims into scapegoats and lovers into executioners. The knocking had been theater, the discovery performance, the grief-calculated deception designed to conceal the most intimate form of betrayal Oxford's ancient stones had ever witnessed. December arrived in Oxford with that particular diffidence winter understands, settling over ancient stones like a scholar's afterthought, present but unobtrusive, necessary but unwelcome. The college had begun to fold itself back into its customary rhythms with the deliberate patience institutions employ when scandal threatens their equilibrium. Students attended lectures, dons pursued their research, the chapel bell marked canonical hours with its eternal indifference to human frailty. Yet something in the air suggested wounds that would require more than seasonal change to heal completely. Dr. Eleanor Vance's arrest had been conducted with the discretion Oxford reserves for its most embarrassing necessities. Early morning, unmarked cars, the minimum of witnesses required by legal procedure. She had maintained her composure throughout, speaking only to request that her research notes be preserved for her successor, a final gesture of academic responsibility that somehow made her crime more rather than less disturbing. Lewis reported these details with his customary precision, his voice carrying neither triumph nor satisfaction, merely the measured cadence of duty discharged. Intelligence corrupted by institutional pressure possessed a particular tragedy that mere criminality could never achieve. The medicinal scent had finally dissipated from the college air, replaced by the sharper tang of winter and the faint, enduring aroma of ancient stone. The college responded to her removal with that measured adjustment characteristic of organisms that have survived centuries by adapting to periodic scandal. Dr. Ashworth's resignation followed within days. Not the dramatic exposure Hartwell had planned, but a quiet withdrawal accompanied by the familiar euphemisms that transform disgrace into administrative transition. Her letter to the college council spoke of pursuing new opportunities, though everyone understood she was fleeing toward whatever obscurity might still accommodate a reputation permanently tainted by association with murder. The revelation of the 1974 scandal proceeded with archaeological patience, each document emerging from sealed files like artifacts from a deliberately buried civilization. University committees issued formal statements, academic journals published corrections. Colleagues who had maintained careful distance during Hartwell's lifetime suddenly discovered profound respect for his scholarship. The truth, when finally assembled, painted a picture of institutional corruption that extended far beyond individual misconduct into systematic sacrifice of conscience to expedience. Hartwell's posthumous exoneration arrived with precise bureaucratic language, technically correct but emotionally insufficient, a vindication that felt less like triumph and more like a post-mortem dissection of wounds that had festered for decades. I had returned to Hartwell's study after the investigation's conclusion, drawn by that species of curiosity that resembles grief closely enough to be forgiven. The room breathed differently now, no longer weighted with urgent questions, but somehow diminished by their resolution. His medieval manuscripts lay open to passages about confession and absolution, their pages still whispering of mortality and enduring truths. But the frantic energy that had animated his final weeks had evaporated, leaving behind only the profound silence of absence. The desk still bore the faint rectangle where the crossword had lain, a pale square in the wood, as if absence might cast its own shadow. I sat in his chair and let the springs complain, surrounded by books that had outlived their reader and would outlive their grief. In the bottom drawer, concealed beneath correspondence files, I discovered an envelope addressed to his brother Michael in Melbourne. Written but never posted, sealed but never sent. The handwriting possessed his characteristic precision, yet the words themselves carried a profound weariness that spoke more eloquently than any bitterness. The letter's date matched his final week, suggesting it had been composed during the same period when he prepared his devastating faculty presentation. "My dearest Michael," it began, "I confess I am tired. So utterly, irrevocably tired of carrying this burden, this knowledge that has become both my cross and my only companion. I've spent 30 years navigating the labyrinth of their discreet silence, witnessing their promotions, their awards, their quiet ascendancy, while my own path remained shadowed by a lie." He had continued with the resigned determination of someone fulfilling a long-deferred obligation, detailing his plan not with fierce glee but with weary duty. The forged manuscript, the evidence from the 1974 files, the precise timing of the faculty meeting, all were described as steps in a necessary, if exhausting, ritual. Most poignantly, he wrote, "I cannot carry any more of other people's sins," then crossed out sins and replaced it with debts, as if even in private correspondence he could not quite abandon scholarly precision. The letter concluded with haunting prescience. "I hope that when the answer is finally revealed, it will bring not merely justice, but perhaps a measure of peace. Though I suspect that for some truths, peace arrives too late to heal the wounds it exposes." The final sentence remained unfinished, a thought left suspended like a question mark in the air. He had been writing it, perhaps, when the knocking began, the knocking that had been not discovery, but performance, not the sound of concern, but the prelude to betrayal. On the windowsill, I noticed indentations on a blotter, faint impressions left by previous writing. Using the soft pencil I carry without acknowledging the habit, I coaxed letters from absence with the light angled across the paper. The graphite found ghosts. J.U.S. Then the stroke faltered into nothing. He had pressed harder at the beginning, then lost conviction, as if the pen had paused above those 7 empty squares and decided to remain silent. The crossword clue that had haunted his final evening, truth delayed, would remain forever incomplete, its answer known but unwritten. Lewis arrived quietly, apologetic as always for interrupting solitude. The charge had been formalized, he reported. Vance would be processed with the efficient machinery of justice that moves more swiftly for the guilty than it ever did for the innocent. He stood at the window and mentioned, without looking at me, that he had liked her, which told me more than it asked. I said something about compassion, not altering physics, and he nodded, understanding that some forces hold us to our ruin, regardless of our worthier intentions. Walking through Oxford's familiar streets in the aftermath of Revelation, I reflected on the destructive power of buried secrets and the way institutions protect themselves by sacrificing individuals to collective preservation. The university would survive this scandal as it had survived centuries of others, transforming controversy into historical footnote through the patient alchemy of time and administrative discretion. Yet something essential had been lost, not merely Hartwell's life, but the possibility of justice that arrives in time to heal, rather than merely to wound. The phrase that had begun this investigation returned with final significance. He was already dead when they knocked. Perhaps all of us are dead long before our hearts stop beating, killed by the weight of carrying secrets too heavy for individual conscience to bear. The knocking that discovers our deaths merely announces what institutional pressure has already accomplished. The transformation of living conscience into historical footnote, personal tragedy into administrative necessity. In the college chapel that evening, I paused before memorial tablets that recorded centuries of academic achievement. Hartwell's name would eventually join this company. His scholarship finally acknowledged, his reputations restored. Yet the tablets themselves seemed to whisper a different lesson, that individual justice often requires institutional amnesia, that personal vindication can only be purchased through collective forgetting. The crossword clue that had haunted his final evening acquired its ultimate irony. Truth delayed. 7 letters. Justice fitted the grid perfectly, yet justice seemed as elusive as ever. His vindication had arrived precisely as he had feared, too late to restore what had been lost, too complete to avoid destroying what remained. The truth had emerged, but like all truth in Oxford, it arrived carrying its own burden of consequences, transforming victory into something indistinguishable from defeat. Standing among those ancient stones where past and present maintain their eternal conversation, I understood that some forms of justice can only be achieved posthumously, and that even posthumous justice carries its own corruption. The echo of justice, when it finally sounded, carried the hollow resonance of an empty chamber, a sound that merely amplified the silence of what had been irretrievably lost. The water meadows stretched beyond the college boundaries like pages from an unfinished manuscript, their winter-pale grass brittle underfoot and whispering with each step that careful commentary which only dead vegetation understands. December had settled over Oxford with that particular authority of seasons that arrive precisely when summoned, transforming familiar landscapes into repositories of memory and accumulated silence. The river Cherwell moved with sluggish determination between banks lined with willows that had surrendered their leaves to November's patient negotiation, leaving behind skeletal arrangements that spoke more eloquently of mortality than any sermon. I had walked here often during the investigation, seeking that species of solitude which allows thoughts to arrange themselves without the interference of human conversation or institutional expectation. Now, with the case concluded and justice administered through its familiar channels, I found myself returning not for clarity, but for that rarer commodity, acceptance of ambiguity. The meadows possessed Oxford's most honest geography, neither ancient nor modern, but simply present, offering themselves as neutral territory where one might contemplate the weight of accumulated evidence without the pressure of immediate decision. The phrase that had begun this investigation echoed with each footstep across the frozen ground. He was already dead when they knocked. Professor Adrian Hartwell had indeed been dead when his colleagues arrived for their faculty meeting, but the statement carried implications extending far beyond temporal sequence into territories of moral archaeology. In the end, they had all been dead, killed not by cardiac arrest or pharmaceutical overdose, but by secrets, pride, and the accumulated weight of buried truth that had poisoned the very ground they walked upon. Hartwell had achieved his justice through death, his reputation finally restored through posthumous revelation that arrived too late to heal the wounds it exposed. The forged manuscript with its coded confession had served its intended purpose, transforming him from scandal's victim into its exposer, yet the vindication felt hollow when measured against 30 years of carrying guilt that belonged to others. He had pursued truth with the patience of a medieval scholar, allowing it to ripen over decades, believing that its eventual unveiling would bring not merely personal vindication, but institutional transformation. Dr. Eleanor Vance had destroyed herself through the very pride that had initially motivated her crime. The intellectual arrogance that suggested she could orchestrate perfect murder while maintaining the facade of grieving colleague. Her medical knowledge had provided both method and cover, yet the same precision that enabled her to calculate fatal dosages had betrayed her through excessive attention to detail. The corrupted crossword, the missing glasses, the medicinal scent that lingered like an unwitting signature, all testified to intelligence applied to deception with such thoroughness it became self-defeating. The college continued its ancient function with institutional resilience that bordered on the supernatural, transforming scandal into footnote through the patient alchemy of time and administrative discretion. Dr. Ashworth's resignation had been processed with diplomatic efficiency, her career ending not in the dramatic exposure Hartwell had planned, but in quiet withdrawal, accompanied by familiar euphemisms. The place adjusted with that incurable patience institutions possess. They keep time better than they keep promises, digesting scandal with the same quiet indifference they displayed toward the changing seasons. A distant bell began its measured commentary on the passing hour, its tone carrying that slight flatness characteristic of Oxford's ancient bronze, a mortal imperfection embedded within supposedly immortal setting. The sound drifted across the water meadows with lazy authority, marking time's passage while remaining somehow outside temporal concerns. That fractional wrongness always unsettled me in ways death seldom does. We forgive the immortal more easily than the merely untuned, yet perhaps that imperfection was the bell's most honest quality, an acknowledgement that even Oxford's eternal verities carried their own corruption. Standing among winter-stripped willows that lined the Cherwell's sluggish course, I reflected on the peculiar mathematics of institutional memory. Universities possess infinite capacity for transforming individual tragedy into collective wisdom, personal failure into pedagogical example, moral corruption into administrative procedure. The investigation had revealed not merely murder, but the systematic sacrifice of individual conscience to institutional preservation, a pattern that extended far beyond St. Bartholomew's College into the very foundations of academic culture. Along the river's edge, I found the provisional script the frost keeps, a dialogue of feet and intentions traced in the thin ice. Here, a pair of prints approached the water and stopped, the toes describing impatience. There, a solitary set turned back upon itself with the economy of someone reconsidering. I could tell, from the Thor's thin glaze lodged in one hollow and not another, that two people had walked together and parted, not in quarrel, but in that quieter grief of different errands. Small deduction for a man who has seen too much, yet it consoled me because it was true and required no interpretation beyond itself. The crossword clue that had haunted Hartwell's final evening acquired its ultimate significance in this setting of natural decay and seasonal renewal. Truth delayed, 7 letters, the answer hovering forever between completion and abandonment. Justice fitted the grid perfectly, yet justice seemed as elusive as the bell's true pitch, present but imperfect, audible but somehow fundamentally wrong. He had pursued his answer with scholarly dedication, believing that intellectual rigor could transform moral complexity into simple equation. Yet the solution had proved more destructive than the original problem. I knelt, a foolish indulgence for knees that have begun to negotiate their terms, and with a twig traced 7 letters into the thin frost on a fallen plank. The first 3 held their nerve. The 4th faltered as my breath warmed what I wrote. The river lifted a small wind, and the word unstitched itself in silence. It seemed right not to force it. Some answers prefer the privacy of being known but unspoken, and perhaps that was mercy rather than defeat. The phrase that had begun this investigation returned with final significance. He was already dead when they knocked. Perhaps all of us are dead long before our hearts stop beating, killed by the weight of carrying secrets too heavy for individual conscience to bear, murdered by institutional pressures that transform living principle into historical footnote. The knocking that discovers our deaths merely announces what moral compromise has already accomplished, the transformation of breathing bodies into repositories of accumulated guilt. Yet something in the meadow's winter honesty suggested a different interpretation. Perhaps the phrase carried not tragedy, but recognition of limits that protect us from consequences we cannot survive. If Hartwell was already dead when they knocked, then he had been spared witnessing the full destruction his revelations would have caused, not merely to his enemies, but to everyone connected to the original scandal, including those he had claimed to love. Some truths, like some people, arrive too late to matter, carrying their own burden of consequences that transform victory into something indistinguishable from defeat. Whether this constituted tragedy or mercy remained as ambiguous as the bell's imperfect pitch, a question that would echo across these meadows long after the particular scandal of Professor Adrian Hartwell had been transformed into historical footnote. The living are condemned to knock, I thought, watching the Cherwell carry its burden of fallen leaves toward destinations it would never reveal. We knock on doors that will not open, seeking answers to questions that have no solutions, demanding justice from institutions designed to preserve themselves rather than serve individuals. The dead, in their wisdom or indifference, do not answer, not because they cannot hear our appeals, but because they have finally achieved that perfect silence which renders all human controversy irrelevant.